Three entitled men thought mocking a pregnant waitress would be the funniest part of their night, until the rumble of 13 Harleys shook the diner windows and everything changed. What happened when these battle-hardened bikers walked through that door and saw her tears? The Route 9. Diner sat like a bright jewel against the darkening sky, its neon sign buzzing and flickering in shades of red and blue that painted the cracked parking lot below. Moths circled the yellow street lamps in wild dances, their tiny bodies casting shadows that moved like ghosts across the pavement. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee mixed with the heavy scent of frying oil, the kind of smell that stuck to your clothes long after you left. The booths were covered in red vinyl that had been patched with duct tape in at least a dozen places, and the old jukebox in the corner played songs from the 1980s that nobody had bothered to update. The black and white checkered floor showed years of scuff marks and stains that no amount of mopping could ever fully erase. This was the kind of place where truckers stopped for a hot meal at midnight, where locals came for breakfast on Sunday mornings, where the coffee was always fresh, even if it tasted like it had been sitting on the burner too long. Nicole moved between the tables with careful steps, her pregnant belly leading the way as she carried plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes to table 7. She was 6 months along now, and her back ached in a way that made every shift feel twice as long as it actually was. The baby kicked sometimes when she stood too long in one place. Little thumps against her ribs that made her smile even when everything else hurt. Her wedding ring caught the harsh white light from the ceiling fixtures every time she reached for a coffee pot or wiped down a table with her damp gray rag. It was a simple silver band, nothing fancy, but she twisted it around her finger whenever she felt nervous or scared. Her husband, Mark, had slipped it on her finger 2 years ago in a small ceremony at the courthouse, and 3 months ago he had kissed her goodbye at the airport before boarding a plane that took him halfway around the world to a place she could barely find on a map. The other waitress had called in sick again, which meant Nicole was handling the entire dinner rush by herself. 15 tables, all of them full. And the cook was already yelling through the window that Order 12 was getting cold. Her feet hurt in her worn white sneakers, the ones with the hole forming near the big toe that she kept meaning to replace but never had the money for. Every dollar mattered now. Every shift, every tip, every penny went into the blue glass jar she kept on top of the refrigerator at home, the one labeled Baby Fund in Mark's messy handwriting. She needed money for diapers and bottles and a crib that did not come from a yard sale. She needed money for the hospital bills that would come when the baby decided it was time to enter the world. She needed this job more than she had ever needed anything, and that desperation sat heavy in her chest like a stone she could not swallow. The regulars were kind to her. Old Frank at table 2 always left a $5 tip, even though his breakfast only cost $6. Miss Betty at the counter asked about the baby every single shift and brought her bags of hand-me-down clothes that smelled like lavender soap. Even the truckers who came through at odd hours treated her with a gentle respect, calling her Hon and Sweetheart, in voices that reminded her of her own grandfather. These people knew her story because small towns did not keep secrets very well. They knew her husband was serving overseas. They knew she was working double shifts to save money. They knew she was alone in a tiny apartment with a leaky faucet and a heater that only worked half the time. And they helped in the small ways that people do when they see someone trying their hardest not to fall apart. But tonight, there were strangers in the corner booth. 3 young men in their 20s who had walked in an hour ago, smelling like expensive cologne and wearing leather jackets that probably cost more than Nicole made in a month. They had smooth faces and perfect hair and watches that caught the light when they moved their wrists. Their car in the parking lot was a black sports car with rims that gleamed even in the dim light. They ordered burgers and fries and milkshakes, and they spoke to each other in loud voices full of jokes Nicole did not understand. She had taken their order with a smile, brought them water with extra ice just like they asked, and tried not to notice the way they looked at her belly with expressions she could not quite read. The diner hummed with its usual Friday night energy. Forks scraped against plates. Coffee cups clinked against saucers. The cook shouted, "Order up," every few minutes. The door chimed whenever someone came in or went out. Nicole moved through it all like she was swimming through water, her body tired, but her mind focused on getting through the shift, on making it to closing time, on adding whatever tips she earned to that blue glass jar at home. She thought about Mark's last letter, the one that had arrived 3 days ago with a drawing of a stick figure baby at the bottom and the words, "I love you both so much," written in pencil that had smeared slightly from the heat wherever he was stationed. She thought about how proud he would be that she was working so hard, how he would wrap his arms around her when he finally came home and tell her she was the strongest person he knew. The 3 men in the corner booth were watching her now. She could feel their eyes following her as she moved from table to table, could hear their voices dropping to whispers and then rising again in laughter that had sharp edges to it. Nicole approached the corner booth for the 3rd time that night, balancing their plates on her left arm while her right hand steadied herself against the table edge. The burgers were hot and fresh, steam rising from the melted cheese, and the fries were piled high, just like they had ordered. She set the first plate down carefully in front of the man with the slicked back hair, then moved to serve his friends. Her belly bumped slightly against the booth, and that was when the laughter started. It was not the kind of laughter that comes from joy or friendship. It was sharp and mean. The kind that cuts through the air like a knife through butter. "Hey, wide load, think you can waddle a little faster with that order?" the man in the middle said, his voice loud enough that people at nearby tables turned to look. His friends erupted in laughter that echoed off the walls, bouncing around the small diner like it was trying to escape, but had nowhere to go. Nicole felt heat rush to her cheeks, that burning sensation that starts in your chest and crawls up your neck until your whole face feels like it is on fire. She set down the last plate with hands that wanted to shake, but she would not let them. She needed this job. She needed every single dollar. She could not afford to lose her temper or say something back, no matter how much she wanted to. "Thank you. Enjoy your meal," she managed to say, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. She turned to walk away, but the words followed her like smoke she could not outrun. "Seriously, shouldn't you be at home or something? This is kinda gross," another one said, gesturing at her belly with his fork like she was something unpleasant he had found on his shoe. The third one joined in, making jokes about whether she could even see her own feet anymore, whether she would pop like a balloon if she bent over too far. Their laughter grew louder and meaner with each comment, feeding off each other like a fire that kept finding more wood to burn. The diner had gone quiet in that terrible way that happens when everyone knows something bad is unfolding, but nobody wants to be the one to stop it. Conversations at other tables dropped to whispers. Forks stopped moving. Even the cook had stopped shouting from the kitchen, and Nicole could feel the weight of all those eyes on her, watching to see what she would do, how she would react. Old Frank looked angry, his wrinkled hands gripping his coffee cup so hard she thought it might break. Miss Betty had tears in her eyes, her mouth open like she wanted to say something, but the words would not come out. The truckers at table 9 looked uncomfortable, staring down at their plates like the answers to everything might be hidden in their scrambled eggs. Nicole walked back toward the counter, each step feeling like it took all the strength she had left in her body. Her throat felt tight, like someone had wrapped their hands around it and was squeezing just enough to make breathing hard. She blinked fast, trying to push back the tears that wanted to fall because she could not cry here, not in front of everyone, not where those men could see that they had won. Behind her, their voices continued, discussing whether they should leave just a penny as a tip, making bets about whether that would make her cry. They talked about her like she was not a real person, like she was just something they could poke at for entertainment while they ate their dinner. She thought about Mark's letter, the one folded in her apron pocket that she had read so many times the creases were starting to tear. He had written about the heat where he was stationed, about missing home, about counting down the days until he could hold her again. At the bottom, in careful letters that showed how much time he had taken, he had written, "Tell our baby I love them already," with a little heart drawn next to the words. He had drawn that heart 3 times before he got it right. She could see the faint pencil marks where he had erased the first attempts. What would he think if he could see her now, standing behind this counter with her hands shaking and tears threatening to spill, unable to defend herself against 3 strangers who thought her pregnancy was something to mock? Nicole grabbed a coffee pot just to have something to hold, something to keep her hands busy so nobody would see them trembling. The men's voices carried across the diner, clear as bells, as they debated whether the food was even worth what they were paying for it, whether a place like this deserved any tip at all. One of them suggested they should complain to the manager about having to look at a pregnant woman while they ate. Another said maybe they should take a picture and post it online with some funny caption about what happens when restaurants hire people who should not be working. Something inside Nicole was cracking, like ice on a pond when the temperature starts to rise. She could feel it breaking apart piece by piece. All the strength she had been holding on to for the past 6 months while Mark was gone, all the determination that had gotten her through every difficult shift and every lonely night. The roar of motorcycle engines cut through the evening air like thunder rolling across an empty plain, so loud that the windows of the diner rattled in their metal frames. Nicole looked up from behind the counter, her eyes still blurry with tears she had not let fall, and watched as headlights swept across the parking lot. 1 motorcycle appeared, then 2, then 5, then more, until a dozen Harley-Davidsons filled every empty space outside. Their chrome pipes and metal bodies caught the neon lights from the diner sign, reflecting red and blue in patterns that looked like fireworks frozen in time. The engines rumbled and growled like giant cats, their sound so deep Nicole could feel it in her chest, in her bones, in the baby that kicked against her ribs as if it could hear the noise too. The riders began to dismount, moving with the slow, careful movements of men who had all the time in the world and knew that rushing never helped anything. They wore leather vests covered in patches and symbols, their faces hidden behind beards grown long and gray, their eyes sharp and knowing behind the wrinkles that came from years spent in the sun and wind. Some were in their 50s, others looked closer to 70, but all of them moved with a strength that had nothing to do with how old they were. These were men who had ridden through storms and deserts, who had seen things that changed them, who had learned long ago that the world was not always kind, but that did not mean you had to accept cruelty when you saw it. The lead rider held the door open for the others, and they filed inside one by one, their heavy boots making solid sounds against the checkered floor. Each footstep seemed to echo louder than it should, filling the small space with a presence that pushed out everything else. The diner fell into complete silence now. The kind of silence that happens when everyone forgets to breathe at the same time. Even the jukebox seemed to quiet down, though the record kept spinning. The three young men in the corner booth had stopped laughing, their faces suddenly very interested in their half-eaten burgers, their hands frozen halfway to their mouths. The lead writer was a huge man with shoulders as wide as a doorframe and a scar that cut through his left eyebrow like a white lightning bolt. His beard was more gray than black, braided in places with small silver beads that clicked together when he moved his head. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and when they swept across the diner, Nicole felt like he was reading everyone's story in a single glance. Those eyes paused on old Frank, who gave a small nod. They paused on Miss Betty, who dabbed at her face with a napkin. They paused on the truckers, on the cook peeking through the kitchen window, and finally they landed on Nicole, still standing behind the counter with that coffee pot clutched in her white-knuckled hands, and that look on her face that said she was barely holding herself together. Something changed in the big man's expression, a softening around the edges that made him look less like a bear and more like someone's grandfather. He walked to the counter with steps that were surprisingly quiet for a man his size, and when he spoke, his voice was rough like gravel, but somehow gentle at the same time. "Evening, ma'am," he said, meeting her eyes with a respect that made her want to cry all over again, but for completely different reasons. "Heard you folks make a mean cup of coffee." Nicole managed a small smile, grateful for these simple, normal words after everything that had just happened. "Yes, sir, we do. How many cups do you need?" 13, if you don't mind. My brothers and I have been riding for a while now." The other riders were settling into the booths near the corner where the three young men sat, their movements slow and deliberate, like they were just choosing comfortable seats and not surrounding anyone. But Nicole noticed how the young men were sitting very still now, their earlier bravado gone like smoke in wind. She started pouring coffee into white ceramic mugs, lining them up on the counter, and the big man watched her with eyes that seemed to see more than most people could. One of the other riders, a man with a long white beard and kind eyes, leaned back in his booth and spoke loud enough for the whole diner to hear. His voice carried across the room like he was giving a speech, each word clear and purposeful. "You know, I was raised that you treat a woman with respect, especially one who's carrying life inside her. My mama would have knocked me into next week if I'd spoken to a waitress the way some folks apparently do nowadays." He paused, letting those words sink into the silence. "She taught me that a real man doesn't mock people who are working hard. A real man doesn't make someone feel small just because he can." The words hung in the air like a bell that had been rung and could not be unrung. Every person in the diner understood exactly who he was talking about and why. The three young men's faces turned red, then pale, their eyes darting toward the door like trapped animals looking for escape. The big man with the scarred eyebrow took a long, slow sip of his coffee, then set the white mug down on the counter with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than it should have. He turned his body just enough that everyone could see his face, could hear every word he was about to say, and when he spoke, his voice filled the diner like water filling a bowl. "We ride for a lot of reasons," he said, his gray eyes moving from table to table, making sure every single person was listening. "We ride for veterans, for their families, for people who can't stand up for themselves when the world gets too heavy. And sometimes we ride because we hear about places where people forget their manners, where they think it's funny to mock a woman who's working hard to provide for her family." He paused, letting the silence stretch out like taffy being pulled. Then he turned his whole body toward the corner booth where the three young men sat frozen in their seats. Now, I'm sure these young gentlemen were just about to apologize and leave a tip that shows their appreciation for the service they received. Isn't that right? The young man in the middle, the one who had called Nicole wide-load, had gone from red to white, all the color draining from his face like water down a sink. His hands fumbled for his wallet, pulling it out so fast he almost dropped it on the table. "We were just leaving," he stammered, his voice cracking on the words like ice breaking under weight. "We didn't mean anything by it. We were just joking around." The big man did not move. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a single threat. He simply stood there like a mountain that had decided to exist in that exact spot, and that was enough. His 12 brothers sat in their booths, silent as stones, their presence filling the diner with a weight that had nothing to do with how much space they took up and everything to do with what they represented. These were men who had seen real hardship, real pain, real courage, and they knew the difference between strength and cruelty. The 3 young men scrambled to pull bills from their wallets, their hands shaking as they laid money on the table. $20 bills, 40, 60, far more than their burgers and fries had cost. They practically fell over each other, trying to get out of the booth. Mumbling apologies that came out jumbled and unclear, their eyes never quite meeting anyone's gaze. They rushed toward the door like their pants were on fire, nearly running into each other in their hurry to escape. The door chimed as they pushed through it, and moments later, their black sports car roared to life in the parking lot, tires squealing as they sped away into the night like rabbits fleeing from wolves. For a heartbeat, the diner stayed silent. Then old Frank started clapping, his weathered hands coming together in steady beats that echoed off the walls. Miss Betty joined in, then the truckers, then everyone else, until the whole diner was filled with applause that washed over Nicole like warm water. The cook came out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron and clapping so hard his face turned red. People were smiling now, real smiles that reached their eyes, and some were wiping away tears of their own. Nicole stood behind the counter with her hand pressed against her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks freely now. But these were different tears, the kind that came from relief and gratitude, and the sudden understanding that she was not alone in the world after all. The big man turned back to her, and his storm cloud eyes had softened into something that looked almost like kindness. "Nobody messes with our waitresses," he said simply, his rough voice gentle as a lullaby. Then he added in a quieter tone, leaning in just enough that only she could hear. "My daughter was pregnant and working tables when her husband was deployed. I remember how hard that was. You're doing just fine, ma'am. Better than fine. You're doing everything right." The bikers stayed for 2 hours, ordering slices of apple pie and cherry pie and chocolate cream pie, refilling their coffee cups 3 and 4 times, filling the diner with stories and laughter that transformed the space from a place of hurt into something that felt like home. They talked about roads they had traveled, and friends they had lost, and the simple joy of riding with the wind in your face and the sun on your back. They asked Nicole about her baby, what names she was thinking about, whether she was hoping for a boy or a girl. They told her stories about their own children and grandchildren, showed her pictures from wallets worn soft with age. When they finally stood to leave, each one stopped to shake Nicole's hand or pat her shoulder with surprising gentleness for men with such rough, calloused hands. They left tips that added up to more than Nicole made in a week, more than enough to cover her rent. And then some. The big man was last, and he pressed a $50 bill into her palm and closed her fingers around it. "For the baby," he said. "Buy something that makes you smile." Then they were gone, mounting their motorcycles one by one, engines roaring to life in a chorus that shook the windows again. Nicole stood in the doorway and watched them ride away into the darkness, their tail lights fading like red stars disappearing into the night sky.